Great. So welcome to a joint meeting of the Select Board and the Advisory Committee to review the Town Administrator's Fiscal 23 budget plan. Before we start, just a quick open meeting law notice review. Pursuant to this combined committee's authority under 940 CMR 29.10 paragraph 8, all committee members are participating remotely via telephone or video conferencing. Due to emergency regulations regarding the coronavirus, the chairs have reviewed the requirements of the regulations, quorum visible. I don't believe any votes are expected, but if they are, they'll be taken by recorded roll call and all members will be allowed to vote. And the meeting, as you heard, is being recorded. The recording will be part of the record. And anyone who wishes to record the meeting is allowed to do so, but they need to notify us. So with that, let me set the stage very quickly. I wanted to thank Heather and the Select Board in general, and Heather in particular, for trying so graciously with a variety of experiments to help streamline some of the processes that both the Advisory Committee and the Select Board have to engage in. And this is the first of those. So we're doing this budget hearing as a combined, this budget review as a combined meeting. There will be other opportunities for us to collaborate. Tonight, as I said, we're going to hear the budget presentation, and the way it's going to work is Mel's going to give an overview presentation. We'll hold off on questions until he's done. Then we'll give AC members and Select Board members an opportunity to ask questions. And the way we're going to do that is the way that it's been typically done for Advisory Committee meetings. So just drop a note in the chat to the host and panelists if you have a question or a comment, and Harry Friedman will continue the job he's been doing for Advisory Committee members and wrangling all of that and keeping people, making sure that people get taken up in order. After the questions for Mel, Melissa will take us through the budget in more detail. That I suspect will be more interactive, but we should still try to use the chat to queue up and allow Harry to continue to manage the queue. And if that proves unmanageable, we'll deal with it when it comes. We're not taking comments or questions from the public. Directly after this meeting, there are separate Select Board and Advisory Committee meetings, which do have their normal public comment period. But this is an opportunity for the Select Board and the Advisory Committee to hear the budget and ask questions of the town administration. So with that, unless you have anything to add, Heather, I'd like to turn it over to Mel.
Nope, that's great.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here along with Deputy, my name is Mel Kleckner, I'm the Town Administrator, and along with my Deputy Town Administrator, Melissa Goff, we're here to present the initial presentation of the fiscal year 2023 budget and financial plan. So we will be working off a PowerPoint presentation. So Melissa, if I could ask you to promote that slides presentation, please. Thank you very much. So again, I'd like to also thank the boards for cooperating and agreeing to convene jointly. Normally, this time of year, we're doing separate presentations, and although sometimes it's a different audience, I think it is actually good for the two boards to meet jointly and listen to each other's questions this evening. So I appreciate that cooperation. And it just so happens that the day the budget legally is required to be submitted, which is February 15th, coincides with the normal weekly meetings of the both boards. So the fiscal 23 budget, I refer to as a new normal budget. We are still having the uncertainty and the impacts of operating within a COVID era. COVID's not done, but we are learning how to live with it and operate our institutions with it. At the same time, there is a lot of impatience with the restrictions and the lack of progress that the town and government in general is making on important policy priorities. However, we still have the structural gap that we've referred to between municipal revenues and expenses. This year in particular, we are actually seeing less state aid than we had in the past, and our operations are continuing to exacerbated the issues in our budget by COVID, including use of COVID aid, prior COVID aid in the budgets. The allocation to the school budget is based on using the 60-40 historical share of expenditures that is embedded in a new formula that I use, the so-called town school partnership formula that I use to begin the budget. This would increase the school budget by about 3.1%, but yet there is still a shortfall given the amount of the budget request of the school department, which results in about $5.8 million. So obviously a big hole to climb out of at this point in the budget process. This year, we deal with the American Recovery Plan. Although it is a separate part of our budget, it's federal funds that don't flow through the normal appropriation process. It still requires a very strategic and long-term plan to use, if we're going to use that for operations, to avoid the budgetary cliff that will occur when these federal funds are gone. So the overall budget balances $383 million worth of revenues and expenses, and we refer to that as all in, by meaning it's not only the general fund, but it includes the enterprise funds and the special revenue funds of the town. And it represents about a 4.3% increase over the prior fiscal year. I previously mentioned that the school department budget reflects an initial allocation under the TSP 60-40 formula, and the superintendent's budget submission has details that everyone should refer to when looking at wanting to look at the details of that budget. Municipal department budgets prioritize employee wages. I know the select board is aware that we have made and as well as the advisory committee, we have made conscious efforts to increase the collective bargaining reserve. Last year, or fiscal 22, we had $0 in that based on some of the concerns around COVID. We did appropriate additional money at the special town meeting in November, and we are allocating even more in the fiscal 23 budget in the reserves to ensure that we can reach wage agreements with our employee unions and our management and non-union employees. Our capital budget represents 8.3% of prior year net revenue, which exceeds our policy by our policy is 7.5%. But when you include debt exclusions, which are significant, that increases to 15.3%, which is a very healthy capital budget. But we want to talk about some of the implications of that as we go forward. Our enterprises are up by 7%. And our reserves and long-term liability funding are meeting our municipal goals, our policies and goals, primarily the 10% of unreserved fund balance, which was a subject of much discussion and recommendations of the BFAC report. We are continuing on a full pension funding program, and we are resuming in FY23 the increased Opeb contribution that we have foregone the last 2 years. Here is a snapshot of the categories that make up our budget, both the revenues and expenditures. Again, it's a balanced budget of $383 million, representing about a 4.3% increase over the prior year. And we will get into those categories as we go forward. So let's start with the revenues. The revenues, you'll see a pie chart of the various categories of the revenues. Property taxes by far is the leading element of our revenue structure. Why don't we go to the property taxes? So the property taxes at $281 million represent over 2/3, in fact, over 70% of the town's overall revenue. That growth is restricted to 2.5% annually based on Proposition 2.5, and it allows the town to levy additional taxes for new growth, which is new construction in the community, as well as any voter overrides or debt exclusions. Our increase over fiscal 23 for 23 is $9.1 million or 3.4% increase. So obviously There is the 2.5% growth in the box below. That's about $6.3 million, and then we had another $2.5 million of new growth. We have over $20 million worth of debt exclusion, debt service costs that are authorized above and beyond the tax levy, and that totals our annual levy. That should be FY23 of $281 million. State aid. So I'm very disappointed to learn that our net state aid is down over last year. I think we all would agree that state revenues have rebounded very well. And yet the governor has proposed a budget that would increase our unrestricted general government aid by only $188,000, which is consistent with what we consider to be an overly conservative 2.7% state revenue growth. So this particular government state aid program is tied directly to this revenue growth factor of 2.7%. Our Chapter 70 education aid is also very minimal. It was increased by $204,000 or about 1.3%. We are now a minimum aid community, and in the governor's budget, we're limited to an additional aid of $30 per pupil. The real big surprise, in addition to some of the conservative budgeting by the governor, was the Mbta assessment. The town's Mbta assessment increased by $481,000 or 9% over last year. It's likely the result of shifts in the 2020 census population among member cities and towns. So some member communities had their rate increased or decreased depending on their relative share of the population growth. But nonetheless, that was a big surprise for us. It is really the result, is the factor of why we're seeing less net state aid from one year to the next. Our local receipts is a better story. These are the receipts that are most prone to economic forces. And so these are the types of revenue sources that really dried up during COVID. They are on the rebound. Our local option taxes, which are marijuana, lodging, and meals, are all up. Actually, the marijuana excise tax is somewhat leveled out because of the competition that's in the region now. That has sort of leveled out those sales there, but lodging and meals very strong and are on the rebound. Similar to our parking meter receipts, we've been able to increase those by $800,000. I will mention that there is a meter fee increase proposal that's been on hold. When the last override was approved, there was a commitment to increase the parking meter rate by 25 cents per hour. At that time, it would have generated about $750,000. However, with the somewhat diminished capacity still left over from COVID, we're thinking that 25-cent increase would generate about $500,000 in FY23. And so I know that the select board have discussed this, and they will continue to discuss this outstanding commitment that was deferred over the last two budget years due to COVID. Our parking and court fines are up, and our field use permits are way up, reflecting resumption of normal activities and some fee increases voted by the Park and Recreation Commission. Moving on to the next category, free cash. So I want to make sure we clarify that what free cash is. Free cash is essentially our unreserved fund balance from the prior year, which gets certified by the state. The state Department of Revenue puts their own review of it and removes and adds to unreserved fund balance depending on a number of factors. In our case, we had a total certified free cash of $14.2 million after last year. We plan on using $11.6 million of that in the FY23 budget, mostly to meet the town's capital plan and various operating reserves. The remaining balance is just left unappropriated to support that 10% unreserved fund balance goal that I talked about. And our $11.6 million will primarily fund the the capital improvement plan at almost $7 million, stabilization fund at $3.5 million, operating reserves at $865,000, and finally, an allocation to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund of $427,000. I should mention that free cash really only funds capital expenses and other reserves of the town. And then other available funds, primarily these are funds from that we get reimbursements from our own enterprise. So the water and sewer and golf pays the town, the general fund expenses that they incur, and that ensures that those enterprises do not receive a subsidy from the general fund and the taxpayers. We are also transferring a significant amount of host community agreement. We created a special stabilization fund where those monies go, and we will transfer them under other available funds. I do want to mention that HCA funds, these are host community agreement funds that are part of every agreement that the town reaches with marijuana retailers. We have over $847,000 worth of HCA funds embedded in the town's budget to fund regulatory maintenance and enforcement activity around the various facilities, but also we are using it fairly aggressively in other areas, including some public health and racial equity funding. I wanted to warn the Select Board and the Advisory Committee that the likelihood is that future legislative activity will restrict our use of HCA funds in the future. And without any related reform of the marijuana excise tax, many of our public health and equity programs that are currently being funded by the HCA will be at risk. Moving on to the expenditures, the various parts of the budget are shown in these percentages anyway, and we'll show different percentages for school and municipal departments when all these other costs are sort of loaded back in to those respective departments. But first, the schools, we've talked a little bit about that. The school budget would be up by 3.1% based on the town school partnership formula. However, the school budget's request is 7.9% increase, which creates the $5.8 million gap, shortfall, we'll call it. There's limited funding for building maintenance in that budget, despite the findings of the matrix report and an expanded building footprint. We begin to talk about those issues at the town school partnership. And of course, there's continued enrollment decreases and use of external grants that we really need to get a handle on as we tackle the school budget this year. And as I mentioned previously, there is a detailed school budget report that is currently available for review. For the municipal department, so my job as town administrator is not only to create an overall balanced budget, but to actually make recommendations to allocate within the specific municipal departments. And so I've done that. We have seen a growth in revenue allocated to municipal departments of 3.5%. However, most of that covers fixed costs and contractual increases that are built into our budget. And I also mentioned that we prioritized a reserve for salary and wage increases. That really doesn't leave a lot for discretionary purposes. But nonetheless, we have tried to strategically allocate some of the revenue that was available to us in various investments and initiatives, including public works, where we funded a new transportation engineer and added professional services for traffic safety, as well as forestry services. In the library, I'm pleased that we're able to restore more part-time staff, and as a result, will not need a waiver that we've needed in the past based on the State Board of Library Commissioner standards. The Planning and Community Development Department looking to add one position that will cover preservation and CPA planning, and also added to sustainability consulting services. In the Select Board, we're adding some part-time licensing support, and in the Fire Department, looking to convert an existing position in fire prevention to a lieutenant to support those fire prevention activities. And finally, in diversity, inclusion and community relations, we're expanding support for language access and some programming. On the non-departmental, we sometimes refer to these as the budget busters because they represent the town's employee benefits and other expensive long-term liabilities for benefits. The town belongs to the Group Insurance Commission of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we are assuming a 5% rate increase for our subscribers. I'm actually hoping that it's limited to 5% because there has been a lot of inflation in the health area. Our final rates will be finalized next month. We also project increased enrollment to cover any increases in our subscriber base. Our pension funding, we are on track to be fully funded by 2030. That used to seem like a long time ago, but it no longer does. So we've been able to bring our investment return assumption down to 7.2%, and still stay with the full funding of 2030, but it does require a very significant, I believe, over 7% increase in that pension funding schedule over the next several years. So that's why we refer to it as a budget buster. And with the Opeb liability, which is referred to as other post-employment benefit liability, essentially is our obligation to cover health insurance for our retired employees and teachers. We've brought that rate of investment return down to 7%. And we'd like to resume our $250,000 contribution to the fund in fiscal 23, which we have not done for the last 2 years. Talking about debt service and special appropriations are really our capital budget. We are going to be able to finance the capital budget with $9 million of our own revenue, our operating revenue. That comes from $2.2 million from operating revenue and the $6.8 million from free cash. Our debt service is increasing by $1.6 million or by 5%. The debt service is the actual principal and interest cost, the amortized cost over time. This in fiscal 23 will be impacted by the $11 million legal settlement that was recently approved. Our total capital expenditures now represent 15.3% of the town's prior year net revenue. Our target is 7.5%. And so, how is it that we've been able to enhance our capital budget? And the answer is it's through debt exclusions. Most of these are major high school, the Ridley School and the related Driscoll and related projects. And we still have a backlog, and we're looking at the Pierce School and Fire Station projects coming up, major growing backlog of capital projects. And finally, we do have non-appropriated and enterprises that really don't, well, the non-appropriated does touch the bottom line of the budget. That's where the Mbta assessment was increased by $480,000. We have the dreaded Norfolk County assessment, although it hasn't increased substantially, it still represents $1.1 million of what I know all of us are frustrated because of the fact that other residents in other Massachusetts counties are not assessed, municipalities are not assessed this fee. For example, Middlesex County most prominently. And our overlay for tax abatements is actually decreased due to some timing around the tax rates. Our enterprises are going up by 7%. Primarily, that's in the Water Sewer Enterprise Fund because of an increase in the MWRA assessment. I also wanted to point out that we've had some declines in fund balance that will need to be addressed in the upcoming rate setting process. Our golf enterprise has strong growth in revenue from the driving range, which has enabled them to use $475,000 of retained earnings to support the master plan. That I always look at the budget as not only just a balancing numbers, but it's an opportunity to really look at some of the policy issues and initiatives are facing the town. This year, I particularly tried to focus on activity of our town meeting. Our town meeting has become very active in setting policies of the town. And so I pretty much looked at town meeting activities over the last few years and trying to talk about them and create some synergy between these and the budget. On sustainability, we have a new focus on zero emissions, and I'm very pleased to have that more narrow focus from our goal. We now have a sustainability director who's a division director in the planning department, and the select board has just approved a new zero emissions advisory board group which takes over the former Climate Action Committee, Climate Advisory Committee. We really will need these both staff and this group to be creative on funding and strategies to reach this very, very difficult goal. I'm very encouraged by the possibility of statewide fossil fuel-free building code options or potentially selected municipal experimentation. If that happens, I promise you Brookline will be in that group of communities who have submitted our home rule petitions and have told the legislature how ready we are to move forward. But it does appear that there will be some progress in this area. But even if it's not, it's definitely affected, this advocacy has affected our efforts at the local level. Obviously, all of our school construction is fossil fuel free. We're expanding solar on anywhere that we can and makes sense. We're electrifying our municipal fleet. We're active in the residential aggregation, electricity aggregation. We purchase renewable energy credits and make certain public and private partnerships whenever we can. Our diversity, equity, inclusion work is mostly been focused on hiring, promoting, and retaining a diverse workforce. I'll put a pitch in for civil service again. I know that it was revocation of civil service in a municipality, a town, is a complicated factor, not only through legal process, but also through collective bargaining. And I know that we removed that petition from the warrant, or that article from the warrant last time. And we hope with the next chief of police, we will make a renewed effort to revoke civil service. I think that would be in the best interest of this town. We're very active in finding to set strategies to procure municipal goods and services in a more equitable manner. We have a number of initiatives going on there. And then the select board has spent a great deal of time over the last year regulating the cannabis industry, requiring a more robust equity plans for existing licensees and expanding licenses with equity-based criteria. Transparency, access, and community engagement. I think that's been a lot of the focus of town meeting. I think a lot of that relates to COVID and how we have really changed around the way in which people participate, access, and participate local government. It's done electronically. And so we are working very hard to, at that point when remote access and participation can be in a hybrid approach, both in person as well as electronically. That implicates a lot of issues, including support for BIG, which is the Brookline Interactive Group, which is our private cable access partner. Community engagement has been a major focus of our policy issues. We have engaged, we have hired a community engagement specialist, but that's just the first step. Community engagement needs to be an ongoing and integrated part of our operations. And then town meeting has also pushed on language access, and that would be access for persons whose English is not their first language. Finally, executive action. I hear from the select board frequently that they need to be more effective and moving the ball on a lot of these policies, and they need to do so. They need to have some support. And so we're talking about some administrative organization and strengthening that support for the select board. Social services really were exacerbated by the COVID. All these problems have been there for us, but sometimes we don't see them or they're not revealing themselves to everyone. Well, they certainly did in COVID. And we had identified a number of areas around what we refer to as the safety net, which is basic food and shelter, mental health issues, vulnerable populations of youth, elderly, and disabled. And then you've heard a lot about the quality of our public housing. When the Police Reform and Reimagining Committee did their reports last year, both of them advocated for stronger and more coordinated social services, but they went about it in different approaches. I committed to hiring a senior advisor, and I have engaged that senior advisor who's what I would call an internal consultant to us. The gentleman's name is Professor Harold Cox. He's a professor and former dean at the BU School of Public Health, and also was the former director of the City of Cambridge's Public Health Department. So Harold is our internal senior advisor, working on a number of areas. And hopefully at the end, we'll be developing, I know at the end, he will be developing ideas on approaches going forward. And then finally, we continue to think that federal funding and other funding is a particularly appropriate use for social services, and that includes not only ARPA, but HCA, which I mentioned before, CDBG, and other funding. And then finally, traffic, bicycle, and pedestrian safety. I just read somewhere where both local, state, national, all of the trends are on a lot more distracted driving, and for whatever reason, a lot of traffic crashes, including those with pedestrians. So the town, and we've had our share of unfortunate crashes in Brookline over the last several months. Our focus is on bicycle and pedestrian safety. The problem is that the town really funds these transportation projects on a pay-as-you-go basis. We rely on State Chapter 90, which is from the gas tax. That $960,000 annually has not really moved at all, despite a lot of advocacy. Our CIP for fiscal 23 includes roughly about $3 million for various traffic and roadway projects. And then whenever we can, we always have a project on our federal TIP, which is the Transportation Improvement Program. We just recently concluded the Gateway East along Route 9, and then we're looking to do the other side of Washington Street using federal funds. I go back just one more point. The last point of this is we are going to see a lot more transportation and infrastructure monies out there. The federal government, Congress has passed a huge infrastructure bill. And I think our challenge is to figure out how to get our projects, our transportation and other infrastructure projects, as shovel ready as possible so that we can seek additional funding from other pockets of money rather than use our ARP or CDBG for some of those projects. That's the end of the policy. I have one more slide to go, and that is the American Recovery Plan. So this is obviously the federal aid program that Congress has provided to every city and town, every local government in the country. We have been very deliberate about the use of these funds, but we're getting close to making our initial recommendations. And so this is something I'll be talking to the select board a lot more. I have a meeting with a subgroup of select board members this week, but my initial recommendations will probably be to create 2 or more funding cycles rather than try to program all the money all at once. By creating multiple cycles, I think we allow more time to effectively plan and evaluate the initial programs that we funded, and also keep money in reserve in the event that we have unanticipated COVID emergency responses. The overall funding availability is $44 million. That's 32.4 coming directly from the federal government and 11.5 from Norfolk County through the Norfolk County. We only have $22 million currently available, so that's another reason why we probably should split up the allocation cycles. We have already appropriated about $1.9 million in the ARPA funds for direct and ongoing COVID and related expenses. So that leaves about $20 million. And that's what I'm going to be recommending that the select board focus on the initial allocation targets for cycle 1. There will be a decision process that helps the board approve these expenditure programs. Not only staff review, but I know the select board is considering some sort of an advisory panel to help them rank those projects. So at this point, Dennis and Heather, my part of the presentation is concluded. So happy to take questions before we move on to Melissa's presentation.
Yeah, so if you have questions or for Mel, drop a note in the chat, and Harry, you can start taking names if there are any.
Nothing yet, Dennis.
There you go.
Okay, so Miriam Ashkenazi.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mel. This was helpful. I read also your memo, which was helpful. even though a lot of the same stuff, but there's a lot to digest. You said something I thought was very interesting. I just love you to clarify or talk a little bit more about, which was the assessment by the Norfolk County. So Middlesex doesn't, like, how do we get out of that? Can we get out of that? Like, I assume the benefit is we have access to their court system, but isn't Middlesex closer? So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that the members of the advisory committee could probably more passionately discuss this, because this is something that, you know, as long as I've been with the town, we've been talking about the really unfairness of the allocation. So it is true that in the state, I would say probably about 15 years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there was a push to take over Middlesex County among other counties. And the state, in fact, did that. And after a period of time now covers all of Middlesex County's legacy costs going forward. That's not the case for Norfolk County. And I believe we've made a case that that's inequitable, that not only of our residents paying state taxes to cover Middlesex County, but now we're paying a special appropriate assessment to Norfolk County. And so we've tried a lot of different alternatives, Miriam, including potential legislation. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, to the extent that we're removed from the county and we're the highest assessed community, other communities would then have to pay the freight unless the state took it over. And so obviously those other cities and towns aren't willing to cooperate.
Miriam, go ahead with your second question.
Great, thank you. So my other question is, in terms of the ARPA funding, that doesn't have to be in the budget that's getting submitted today. That's completely separate process with a separate budget, correct? Or is that something that's already been, you know, some of those things are showing up somewhere in the existing budget?
No, it is a total separate fund of money. However, I would say that the use of ARPA funds is very much related to the FY23 budget. First of all, there's many expenses that are eligible in ARPA that are also in the town's budget. So there's a lot of overlap that could create some flexibility. And also, I think that, you know, clearly there's an expectation that some of the funds could be used to support operating revenue that was lost. That's the theory behind the revenue replacement category. But to answer your specific question, there is no direct legal connection with ARPA and the town's budget. In fact, the town meeting will not be appropriating funds for expenditures funded through ARPA.
Thank you.
Pam Lodish.
Got it. I just unmuted. Okay, my question has to do, Mel, you mentioned that you were in this budget was an expansion of your office essentially. And this talked about the pressures of the select board to keep up as volunteers with all the different projects, assignments, committees that they've had. That's really impossible to put in all the time that's necessary to do all the things the town meeting that has directed. And I'm wondering, when you add this senior position, whether it's premature, and this would be my reason. I've heard some talk about the fact that maybe Brookline should think about becoming a city and having a mayor like Newton. And I'm wondering how this would fit into the discussion if you were to set up a new system now, and then in the next year, we would move in somehow we'd move in another direction of considering changing our whole charter.
Sure. You know, I think the kind of changes I'm talking about are fairly modest. They're not major structural changes in the way things work. I think they're just providing more resources and more focus. So I don't think that there's anything that would be sort of undone or couldn't be undone or would be a significant investment. And, you know, I honestly believe that that kind of change would take several years to accomplish.
John Van Scoyoc.
Thanks, Harry. Thank you, Mel. I just love some further guidance on this concept of new normal, because it seems to suggest that you see a path forward that will involve the town putting more money or new monies into social services that it does not now commit to social services. But I'm not sure where that money is coming from. And is there, in your mind, is it absolutely not going to come from non-recurring revenues such as ARPA? And if it isn't going to come from ARPA, is it going to come from overrides? And can we really build social services on unreliable overrides?
Well, thank you, John. I think that really the question that begs the major question I think that we're faced with this year, and that is to what extent can the federal funds, and we've used federal funds before, it's not a surprise, we've used CDBG ourselves, but ARPA provides quite a significant sum of money. And the question is, are we able to allocate funds for those services? Should we allocate those funds when we don't currently have a plan to sustain them once the federal plan or federal funding is over? And that really is the question I think we have to wrestle with. To answer your question, there is no significant funding for the kind of fundamental social services in the town's budget. It's relying on the federal funding with that caveat.
Bernard Green, did you have a question?
Yes. John basically asked the question that I was really thinking about. I'd like to sort of elaborate a little more. The new normal seems to be the theme of the budget message to some degree. And while we all are sort of impatient with the inability of the town to address the many needs of our residents, for example, the housing authority and capital needs in that area, I guess I just want to make sure that we step back and make sure that we realize that, while we have a money tree, which is a high valuation of property in town, if we shake that money tree too much, the fruit's gonna go away. And I guess, my point is that I think we have to be very, very careful how we think about the new normal spending that is, seen throughout your budget message.
Thanks, Bernard. I think it's a great point. I challenge everyone who is submitting an application under the ARP to identify strategies to make that funds go further, whether that means creating some sort of a partnership or creative arrangement, or maybe using the ARP to secure other federal funds that are available. I think that is the challenge. That is the way in which we can expand our federal dollars and perhaps be able to meet some of those needs in the social service arena. But it's not easy. And but I guess the question is, so if we cannot spend those funds on things like that, what are we going to spend them on? And because everything seems to have that same flavor, which is, okay, let's spend some money on it, but in 2 years, then the money's not going to be there. So I think that is a challenge for every municipality dealing with the ARP, frankly.
Harry Bors.
Sure, I have both a question and a comment. First, let me just say thank you to Mel and the staff for putting together this financial plan and the document. For those who are new to the advisory committee or tuning in and aren't aware, it's a pretty remarkable document. It has been lauded, it has been awarded, I think probably envied by other municipalities, and it's great to have that to work with. My question is, looking at the pension and looking at the OPEB, the assumed rate of returns, you have two separate numbers, a 7.2% and a 7%, and I'm wondering why the discrepancy between those two numbers.
Well, first of all, Harry, thank you for the comments, and it's I want to specifically acknowledge Melissa Goff, who is really the architect for this budget and budget document. I don't know the answer to that question. I believe we have a little bit more flexibility on the OPEB because we don't really have a target yet, whereas the pension, has other factors. It's 2030 we're trying to reach, and so I think we weren't able to go as aggressively down to 7% as we did with the OPEB, but I'm not positive of that. I don't know, Melissa, do you have a?
Sure, those are decisions of the retirement board, but essentially, I talked to Frank Zika, who is the administrator for the retirement board, and they are looking to bring the rate at our next revaluation. They're looking to bring it down again because for the past 2 years we've had some strong performance. So they're kind of looking to bring the rate down, potentially filing a warrant article on a COLA. So there's more to come in that, but that is the goal every time that we go for the pension reassessment. We look to see, is there a way, can we keep to the funding schedule? Can we bring the rate down? What are the assumptions that we're making? This past year, we stayed at 7.2, but we're expecting that in the next one, we'll have some changes there.
Okay. Then my comment really has to do with debt finance capital and per capita debt. I was looking at the numbers in here, which you have pegged in there in this budget at 3%. And I think you remarked that that's still considered safe within the 6%. And 3%, I suppose, is reasonable as a percentage, though certainly still real money. But what struck me more was when we factor in the override, and that jumps to an 11% debt burden. And while the 3% may be great for the town capital T, 11% for the town small t is pretty significant. And so my comment is, I think as we walk through this budget and think about things which were mentioned just a moment ago about expansions of services and those sort of things, we really have to keep our eye on that and be mindful of it, because I think that is a broad community conversation that we're going to have to get ready for, especially with some of these big projects in the offing.
Thank you, Harry. I also think that we need to keep our eye on that. The bond rating agencies, I think, frankly, they, if a town chooses to override Proposition 2.5, they're fine with that. But to Bernard's point, there comes a time when we're going to the voters on major capital projects. At the same time, perhaps we might need an override in the future, and we've got to think about what these cumulative impacts on our tax burden are, among other reasons, that from public policy for affordable housing and other social things. The cost of housing is a direct relationship to the taxes.
And I would just add that this is really the first time that we've been able to have an estimate for debt exclusion in time for the release of the financial plan. So, looking in the 2 years from now to see kind of the impact of that. Traditionally, we haven't had those estimates in time, and they're usually right before the vote. So at least now there's some time to kind of digest that and really understand what the implications are for both the fire station project and for Pierce.
Elisa Jonas.
Hi, just mentioning that you mentioned the fire department, I do just want to urge priority for those fire stations, because I just think the health of the people who we have working for us is one of the most important things that we should be considering. So I would, 2 questions. One is about OPEBs. What direction is the liability going? Are we at all seeing an improvement, or where's that going? And especially given inflation in healthcare costs, what do you think? What are you projecting for the future? And the second question is about transportation. You talked about a lot of federal funding being available, but we have to have shovel-ready projects, and we have a teeny transportation department. I know that there was discussion about hiring somebody else to provide further support, and I'm wondering, from a cost-benefit analysis, would it be advisable to have additional staff there, or has this been discussed?
Sure. Well, we do have added a transportation engineer position in the budget. So we did add funding for the transportation. My own feeling is, we really need to figure out, even by using ARP money, how to get projects more shovel ready. I'm thinking, for example, the Davis Path footbridge. To me, that's a perfect project for federal money, and I would be disappointed if we couldn't be ready to have that project fully funded by some federal infrastructure program. As far as OPEB goes, I think we're holding our own, Lisa, but I don't have the report, the funding report ready. I don't know, Melissa, is our liability going up extremely higher than the rate at which we're able to invest some money?
So we're in the process of refreshing that. That report is also done every 2 years as well. So we'll have a new set of numbers coming out on the liability. I can tell you that we've got over $80 million in the OPEB trust fund, which is probably one of the highest, if not the highest in the state. So in terms of, dedicating funding to address the liability, I think we're in good shape there. And then I'll touch base with Justin on kind of where we are with the current experience. I'll make sure that we have that for the A&F subcommittee meeting as well.
And Birnbaum?
Yes, thank you, Harry, and thank you, Mel. I believe this is your swan song in terms of this presentation, and we all wish you well. I know whatever your determination in your next life. And I also think the presentation, the printed presentation, was excellent, and I thank you and the staff for it. I have two questions. One is, one of the burps at this point in the financials is the difference between the school's proposal and the town's proposal for the Brookline Public Schools. And I'm wondering, at this point, is this in the hands of the town school partnership group, or how are we addressing this right now? $5 million, I believe, is the stretch, and it seems fairly considerable. So where are we on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for those comments, Ben. Yeah, I mean, that's the issue here is to what extent is it reasonable to expect that we can reduce that shortfall to a more manageable amount? It is in the town school partnership discussion, and I think it's going to require that collaboration between the select board, the school committee, and the advisory committee. That's really the only way we can make changes to where we're at. They require policy level discussions. There are implications for those, and I'm looking forward at perhaps the town school partnership to create an opportunity to go back to various the boards and commissions to seek consensus. I think the advisory committee does that as well. They play a facilitative role given your responsibility to make overall recommendations on the budget.
If I could ask one more quick question. We now have a new health department director, and I'm wondering, you mentioned a consultant earlier. I wonder if any thought is being given to bringing in somebody to help us comprehend the needs of a health department, not only in terms of the plague, as one can refer to it, but also in terms of the needs of the town. I believe, it can be frustrating to try work with the health department. I know they've been stretched for the last 2 years in ways one could not imagine, but are we looking at that and what its function is and how it needs to function?
Well, definitely related to its connection to mental health and other social services. Definitely, and that's why I brought on Professor Cox to support that effort. I think our new director has a lot of great ideas about how the public health aspects directly related to the COVID or other disease prevention and other things can work better. But it's really that connection with the social services. It is called the Department of Health and Human Services, and I think that. Since the last reorganization, when we split off the department to create a Department of Diversity, Inclusion, Community Relations, I think we've kind of lost some of that support for human services. And we have a lot more needs these days. So, that's an area that I think Professor Cox will be working with the health director on.
Okay, thank you.
Raul Fernandez.
Thanks, Harry. And thanks, Mel, for the presentation and building off of Ben's question and comments just a minute ago. Yeah, and going back to this new normal conversation, I think this is a really important juncture for us right now, and how we use the ARPA funding in the short term, but also as a bridge toward our future budgets is really important right now. And there's I think a big decision that we have to make that will inform a lot of the smaller decisions. And what I think Mel's outlining in his memo, and we saw, by the way, if you haven't seen the BCF presentation from last Tuesday, please go to Brookline Interactive Group and find it on the YouTube and watch it. And we're also going to be getting a report that I think is going to be widely distributed as well. We should be getting that very soon. But what it made clear is that there are people in our community who are living right now at essentially the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that there are many more of us who are further up that pyramid. I'll even include myself as part of that group, and those are our neighbors. And right now, our budget has a lot to say about everything from paving roads to snow removal to public safety and many other important things that it should have a lot to say about. But very little about the health and well-being and ability to live and thrive of our neighbors. And that's really what we saw outlined so clearly in the BCF presentation around ARPA funding that really should be guiding our budget moving forward. I think there's never going to be enough money. We can literally double our budget and we're still going to have the exact same conversations, because it's not a conversation about dollars, it's a conversation about priorities. And so I say it's a big decision for us to make, because we've got to decide there's no one else, right? There's this group and there's town meeting. That's it. And the community that's speaking out. But we've got to decide where we're going to, if we are going to start to shift our priorities. I'm certainly of the camp that thinks we should, and that food insecurity and housing insecurity and mental health support should be better reflected in our budget. It's in some cases somewhere in our budget, but I think better reflected in our budget. And yeah, it's as part of this that I do think that we should be having more conversations about how to raise revenues. I've supported and I'll continue to support the overrides for the schools. I'll support the override for the fire department as well. I think these are really important things that we need to fund. But also we have a huge gap in social service needs that we have to include as part of that complement to some of the points earlier. The ARPA funds will get us maybe through the next couple of years and will address a small portion of those needs, but there's a much larger set of needs that we need to start to invest funding in. And some of that is going, I think, to mean raising revenues to be able to do that. So if we're ready to make that determination, I know I am, I know others are, then we need to start planning for the future instead of saying, well, there's going to be a cliff 2 years from now or 3 years from now when the ARPA funding ends. We have the ability right now to plan so that there isn't a cliff, so that we can continue to meet those needs.
Stephen Reeders.
Yeah, I just wondered, everyone's seen this rampant inflation that was 9.1% today, wholesale prices increased over the year. What the impact would be if this continues throughout this year and into 2023 in terms of, for example, potential overruns on capital budgets, and whether we have a buffer for that, or how it hasn't happened for many years, 30, 40 years, that we've got this degree of inflation. Do we have a buffer or a proposal, or can we run sensitivities? How will it affect the budget, and what should we think about?
Sure, I think it's a great question, Stephen. This inflation, I have worked, in local government during high inflationary periods, and where I see most of the impact is in wage growth, sometimes the healthcare and the benefits, certainly utilities, the cost of fuel and electricity, and In some cases, we have protected ourselves against those. So for example, we had a labor agreement or a services agreement, we have those locked in. But I think it's a great point. I think we need to do more sensitivity around some of those impacts from the inflation.
Thanks. I mean, in the meanwhile, should we sort of be a little bit prudent with this year until we really know what the impact might be, or do you think we are being prudent?
I don't know yet. I don't know enough about the long-term outlook on inflation. I think it's probably here to stay in some form. We can't keep going the way we've been going. One of the things the advisory committee has done the last 2 years has decided to take some of the reserves that I was recommending be allocated, for example, the stabilization fund appropriation, and put it in the operating reserve of the advisory committee that is able to be funded throughout the year. And that may be something the advisory committee is interested in doing to provide more flexibility from some of those pain points on inflation.
So I know that the questions are continuing to drop into the chat. There will be an opportunity later after Melissa to ask more questions. I think it's really important to be aware of time and let Melissa go through her slides, and we'll pick up the queue afterwards.
Thank you.
So go ahead. Thanks, Mel.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. I did also want to thank the rest of the budget team. We've had, a lot of changes happening this year with Justin covering acting finance director role. We've brought Tyler Belisle-Toller on as our ARPA administrator / budget analyst. And then Devin has also been very interested in learning about the process, and she's done a lot to help with the coverage as well. So I just want to thank them for all of their hard work on this budget. It has been a very intense process, and I was just noting some of the other things that were going on in the midst of us wrapping this up. The final rule for ARPA came out. We had to close out the CARES grant, that $5.2 million grant. We had our first quarterly report for ARPA due. We're preparing currently for the bond sale. We upgraded our board and commission software, almost ready to launch that. We're in the process of implementing hybrid meetings. We're prepping for the USGA. We have 3 active department head searches going on, and we also have active collective bargaining going on as well. And that's just a few of the things that is currently, normally in a given year, the only thing we would need to worry about is the budget. But now we've got all these moving parts kind of, impacting, and then also our continued, engagement on COVID and response and departmental issues that go on around that. So I just want to really thank the team for really pitching in and wearing multiple hats. And it's been really great kind of working with everyone. It's been a great team. So this slide here is just an overall summary of revenue and expenditures. So you can see, our revenue growth is 16.7, but then when you deduct your general fund operating budget and your water and sewer, how we get to our balanced expenditure side of the house as well. This is another pie chart that we put together. You saw the one earlier under Mel's presentation, but essentially what we do is we take an exercise that we do at the end of the year. We provide the schools with a report for their filings with the Department of Education that shows the town services provided on behalf of the schools, whether that be for snow plowing, building maintenance, police and fire support, crossing guards. And we essentially project that into the budget going forward, and it's kind of more accurately shows the support on the school side. So about 60.7% of the budget is for schools, and then you can see the rest of the breakout in the other areas of the budget as well. This is another summary. All of this information is going to be posted on the website shortly after we're done with this presentation. I also did get someone messaging me through the chat about the budget books. Those should go out by the end of the week. And I think there might be some sets that will be available sooner if you want to, shoot me an email, and if there's anything ready and you want to come into town hall and pick it up, we'll make that available as well. So this is another summary of the general fund budget. So you can see for general fund, the total revenue growth is 15.2. Then you deduct your non-appropriated expenses, which is state and county charges, overlay, and we have about $14.8 million available for town and school departments. And then you can see how those allocations are distributed: town, school, and then non-departmental. Our major benefit budget, that's the biggest piece of the non-departmental. And then coming in at the end, you've got your revenue finance CIP, our special appropriations. This is a snapshot of our local receipt experience and where we're budgeting for fiscal 23. So you can see kind of pre-COVID numbers coming in 19 and 20 at $35 and $37 million. We're getting back there, but we're still seeing some sluggish areas in local receipts, mostly around parking. Still haven't seen a fully rebounded local option room excise. And then we also know that, earlier in 19 and 20, some of the local option marijuana was likely because we were the only operator in town. So we likely won't see that rebound to, pre-pandemic areas. And you can see that we are showing some growth in general government. That is, primarily around some of the permitting that we're doing there. We have some parking and court fines, slowly rebounding, not getting back to where it was pre-pandemic. And then most of the departmental other is in parking meters. And that's just kind of growth based on year-to-date experience. This is a chart that shows how we're allocating our free cash. So free cash essentially is what is available at the end of fiscal 21 as certified by Department of Revenue available for appropriation. So we had $14.2 million available. So we basically are looking at kind of where we are with our fund balance position and making recommendations around what to either leave unappropriated or put into the stabilization fund. So that's about $6.1 million. Then we have a target for our liability reserve, which essentially is 1% of our prior year net revenue. So that is where we get the 132,000 recommendation. I skipped over the first bucket, which is our operating reserve. And so 75% of the funding for the reserve fund comes from operating funds, and then 25% comes from free cash. So that $732,000 meets that obligation. Our CIP has a target of 6% of prior year net revenue, and then using free cash to get to 7.5. So in order to meet that target, we need another $4.4 million. And then the policies say that if there's anything left after distributing to those first four buckets, we'd look at what is in our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And if there's less than $5 million in the fund, we would allocate a percentage of what's left of free cash. So that would be $427,000. And then anything available after that could go into any of those buckets or any other, one-time use unfunded liabilities. In the past, we've put money into pensions and OPEBs to kind of help further support those funds. This year, we're recommending that the entirety goes to support the needs in the CIP. This is a projection of where we think fund balance will be after meeting these recommendations with the $6.1 million, so that you can see that if all holds with what we are currently looking at with revenue, we're projecting that we will get to the 10.13% in fiscal 20 at the conclusion of fiscal 23. A lot could change between now and then, but this is just basically based on the current experience with our fund balance growth. These are the changes in our expenditure budget for the general fund. So you can see kind of the major areas that are growing: our school budget, our benefit budget, and then followed behind is our town budget as well. These graphs are pretty similar to what we presented last year because our schedule was set for fiscal 22 and 23. We'll look to have a new schedule in 24 and 25, and we'll have some changing assumptions based on that. But currently, we're sticking with the existing schedule as determined by the retirement board. Same thing with OPEBs. We are increasing $250,000. We had paused that for 2 years during COVID. So we're looking to resume the funding plan around the unfunded liability for group health benefits. This is last year's update. I just realized that I didn't update this particular slide. So I will make sure that when we post it, it will be a corrected version of the changes in the budget. This slide here is a snapshot of our water and sewer enterprise fund. So you can see the revenue and the expenditures for water and sewer. I will say that we have made some improvements in the printed form in OpenGov. We previously had used images for a lot of what you see in the interactive budget, and that's what is on this slide here as an image. We are flipping to what's called tiles, which are easier to read, a little bit bigger. The only difference as you navigate in OpenGov is that there'll be now a link at the bottom to click to get to the report, so you can kind of dig into the detail. And so just kind of flagging that for, I know some advisory committee members really like kind of drilling into that detail. And obviously we'll be here if you have any questions on navigating the interactive budget. This shows the snapshot of the Golf Enterprise Fund. I will note that there is a use of retained earnings to fund some of the master plan work. We've seen some strong returns in golf, particularly around COVID as options for recreation were limited. We did see a lot of enthusiasm around play at the golf course, and hopefully with the USGA in town, that would also continue as well. So for the Recreation Revolving Fund, we're also showing some growth here, and that's kind of a resuming some of the normal activities around, recreation. Those were limited, during COVID, and so kind of looking to have some of the programming resume as well. And then we have our capital improvement plan. And so we, oops, let me just go back one, sorry. We've got an investment of about $402 million. Obviously, most of that is coming from the estimates around the fire station and the Pierce School as well. We're meeting our requirements of 6% of prior year net revenue, and then also using free cash. We're at 8.3% when you just look at the general fund, and then when you look at the debt exclusions, we're at 15.3%. This is an overall summary of the components of the CIP and how we are defining our policy targets for net revenue. These are some of the major projects within the CIP. I did have a preliminary review with the advisory committee before the final version come out, just to kind of go over some of the project proposals here. Not much has changed from the preliminary CIP. The only change from the preliminary was the switch of the timing from with Skyline Park and Schick, which we talked about with the subcommittee as well. So our long range financial plan, this is what we use to kind of start the process, but then we're always continuing to look at the activity around our revenue and expenditures and projecting where we think we're going to be with certain cost items. So, the inflation question is definitely, something that we think about. It's something that we, are changing our estimates around our borrowing. We consult with our financial advisor around the assumptions for borrowing costs. I think when we put out the forecast in December, we had a 2% wage assumption in the budget at that point, and we've obviously bumped that up to 3% for fiscal 23. It's something that we are, continuing to monitor and look at, but obviously with a lot going on, it definitely needs a little bit more attention as well, especially with some of this inflationary pressure. So this essentially shows our revenue and expenditure projection for the out years. Some of the assumptions that are in the forecast are outlined in the budget message. So assumptions around new growth, $2.5 million for the next few years, and then it goes down to 1.8. Don't have any major pipe projects in the pipeline for new growth, so that's a pretty conservative estimate at this point. Local receipts showing some modest growth, recovery of parking meters kind of a couple of years from now, but most of these items don't change all that dramatically. So not seeing kind of a huge boost in the local receipt area. State aid, we're hoping that we'll have better news when the House comes out with their version of the budget. and, you know, still having a conservative outlook going forward, because if we are continue to be a minimum aid community around Chapter 70, that means that our growth is going to be limited to either a per pupil number that is applied across the board, or whether or not there is a change to the foundation budget for education. Other available funds, that's mostly reimbursements from for benefits from the enterprise and revolving fund. That is also where we're having the host community stabilization fund transfers come through, noting that I'm only projecting kind of 4 years for now, kind of assuming that at some point it's going to taper off and we're going to have to deal with how we deal with those expenses, whether or not they would continue or whether or not they would go away when the revenue goes away as well. And then you can see, you know, on the town and school, we have some certain assumptions around bargaining in the out years as well. And then the school department projections, those are the same numbers that they gave me in the forecast in December. So, you know, they would probably look to modify that if anything changes on their end with the budget. And then for our benefits, we have certain assumptions around group health. And our debt service is pretty much the schedule that's currently in the CIP, and the debt plan is included in that, along with the projections around the 2 debt exclusions as well. So this is just a snapshot that shows kind of the projected annual growth, and you can see the structural gap between revenue and expenditures year over year, and then the cumulative growth of that gap as well. So I will stop that here, and we can pick up questions again for people. And then also, obviously, I'll be in departmental meetings with the advisory committee. So if there's, you know, departmental specific areas that we need to get into, you know, I'll be there. Justin will be there, or Devin or Tyler. We've got a lot of people trying to cover the base. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to go back to my original list. John Van Scoyoc.
Thanks, Harry. And I was remiss earlier I did not thank Melissa and Mel and the others who have put this together, and it truly is thorough and very informative, and always year after year a very important start to this budget process. I did see a question and answer question from Natalie Alinos. I think maybe Dennis was intending to share it with others, but I'll go ahead and share it if that's okay, Dennis. She would like to see enumerated, and so would I, the positions in the various departmental budgets that are currently vacant. And this, I was glad to see that question asked, because it gets to one area of this presentation that I think we could perhaps improve upon, and that is simply the detail as to the actual personnel numbers, department by department, and personnel numbers in terms of departments that have an increase in full-time equivalent positions, and how many, departments that have a decrease in full-time equivalent positions, and how many, and furthermore, departments that have vacant positions, and for how long have they had those vacant positions. Payrolls are so important to this budget challenge that we face year in and year out, and they are so important when it comes to that gap between the money we have to spend and the pressures on our budget. And they are tied into collective bargaining. And we know that collective bargaining tends to come in at around, increases of 2.5 to 3% increases, right, each year. And right there, you can see how we've got a problem. So the number of personnel, the increases and decreases, all very important. And I know that if you dig hard enough, the individual like me can find those numbers somewhere in these documents. but I would love to see it all on one page. I think we need that overview all on one page of exactly what's happening in terms of increases, decreases, and vacancies. And there's more too, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
I would say, John, that that information absolutely is there. There in section 2, we have an FTE table that shows the changes by department in FTE growth. I would say that the only thing about the vacancy number is not there because that changes on a day-to-day basis. If I told you a number today, it would change tomorrow. And I can say we fully fund all positions. So to the extent that there is a vacancy, the salary savings stays in the departmental budget. And typically we've used salary savings to support other areas within that department as well.
I wanted to expand on that a little bit. I saw Natalia's question about, the process, if there is budget savings as a result of vacancies, what happens. So I would just confirm what Melissa said. Vacancies are constant. There's always vacancies. There's always a constant, transition in our workforce that creates vacancies. So, but we will document that. The other thing is in some departments, and I'm thinking primarily in the public safety departments, there are minimum staffing, in some cases, contractual requirements. In other cases, they're just policy requirements or service requirements. And to the extent that there are vacancies, we use that funding to pay overtime to meet those minimum staffing requirements. But it'll all be spelled out, and I don't think there'll be any question as to where those vacancies lie in the full-time equivalent analysis as well, John.
Miriam Ashkenazi.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the USPGA? Is that going to bring us any revenue? Is that going to cost us money? Where does that fit in all of this?
Yeah, the US Open is coming in June, and really the concept there was there's a couple things that we tried to accomplish. One is it not costing us any money. So to the extent you see police officers out conducting traffic or other services, those are all compensated by the USGA directly. There is some use of town property, which we've negotiated agreements, rental agreements, and then there's some community partnership money. I would say that it does not represent a windfall by any means. It's just really covering our costs and supporting the event.
Carol Levin.
Thank you. As always, I'm in awe of everything that Melissa has in her head. I've been looking at your pie chart of the fully allocated operating budget for 23. And when I think about the potential infusion of $20 million this year and next year, I think about and how we could possibly fund those things moving forward. I wonder, after we pay everything that we're either by policy or contract obligated to be spending money on, how much of that 300 and whatever it is, $48 million do we actually have discretion over? So if you redid this pie chart and showed things that we're obligated to do either by contract, collective bargaining, or by policy, how much do we have to quote unquote play with, assuming that we didn't want to deal with, paving our highways or whatever?
I would say that a large majority of the budget is non-discretionary. Between a bylaw mandate and staffing requirements for certain functions, I don't think there's a lot of wiggle room. I haven't quantified it, specifically, because I think interpretation of mandated is also something that likely would probably need to kind of get weeded through as well. But I would say that a large majority of our budget is personnel, and those are the people providing services to the town. So to the extent that there's anything discretionary, it would be a question of choice of service that is no longer needed.
Thanks, but I'd love to, not tonight, but moving forward for the advisories discussions, to have a magnitude of number to start comparing to the $20 million.
Heather Hamilton?
Thank you, Harry. So there was a slide for the CIP projects, and I was kind of surprised to see that the third project was classroom capacity, listed at about $9 million. Have we checked in with the schools? Is that still an accurate number, and is that still an accurate need?
So those are the lease costs associated with the spaces that we're renting. It is consuming our CIP. I think members of the advisory committee have been itching to get that off the CIP for several years now. But as far as I'm aware, that these are existing obligations that the school department still needs in order to run programs in those buildings.
Great, thank you.
Carla Banker?
I would just add to that, Heather, that the classroom capacity title is not, it doesn't really encompass everything, since some of that money goes to lease spaces for administrative offices, and the capital subcommittee of advisory has been having conversations with the capital subcommittee of the schools, so we can sort of figure out what space is needed and whether, with the construction of new schools and lower enrollments, whether any space on various campuses has been freed up so that we could reduce that amount in the CIP. But that's not my question. My question is, if somebody remind me what's going on with the CPA and CPA funds, and are they integrated into the financial projections for the next 4 or 5 years?
The CPA, meaning the Community Preservation Act, which was passed by referendum by the voters, and will apply a surcharge of 1% of taxes to fund a CPA fund that will be appropriated by town meeting with the approval of a special CPA committee. So they're not projects that are, well, Melissa, are they integrated in the CIP yet?
No, so essentially the only thing that we've assumed around CPA is the support of the staff person. I think one of the first tasks for the CPA committee is to actually do a needs assessment that would then identify projects suitable for CPA funding. And then once we have that, we would look to incorporate that into the plan.
And I would just I would just add that we're probably about 2 weeks away from appointing that CPA committee. That's been on my very long list of to-dos.
So just a question on CPA, what's the obligation of town meeting to appropriate funds? Will they have a plan to fund something? Well, in addition to the staff person, anything else that in the spring, the town meeting will be prepared to fund from CPA?
Yeah, I'm envisioning a warrant article that would be separate from the budget article. So, but I still need to go through the particulars of what's required technically in order to kind of identify the areas that are required for funding and how that article would be infused into the budget. So still need to do a little bit of research on what the Department of Revenue requires, but I'm envisioning it's going to be a separate warrant article.
And that 1% equates to about what? About $1.2 million, did we say?
Yeah, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but
I seem to recall it was about $2 million, but that was several years ago. So,
Okay.
Carla, are you all set?
Well, I was going to ask one more question. Melissa, I know you managed to keep all of the stuff in your head, but just listening to Mel's response earlier about various funding sources for various programs and services, the local funding, state funding, and federal funding. Is there someplace a chart that kind of lists at least the capital needs that have been identified for the town, and in another column, what the potential funding sources to address those needs might be, whether there are federal dollars, whether there's CDBG money. I guess what I'm asking is, could we be doing more if we had better or greater access to funds outside of the town CIP funding? I mean, ARPA funds can be used for capital projects, but then there's the federal infrastructure program. And how do we know which source of funds to tap for which project?
Yeah, I think, you know, they're probably, we talked about this, I think, when the CIP first came out. How do we identify areas that, you know, might also be eligible for ARPA, and also merging that with the request list for ARPA. So I think that's something that probably does need some continued work as well. And I think that the details of the infrastructure bill, we're still learning about as well. I think the governor announced a commitment of $5 billion for roadway, $2 billion around climate resiliency, and I think $1 billion for, I can't remember what the third category was. We're trying to understand whether or not those monies would come directly to us or whether they would run through the TIP process. I think Erin is concerned about the timing and then kind of lining that up in order to leverage the money as well. Knowing how long it can be to get a project funded through the TIP, trying to make sure that if we can get our ducks in a row around design, and then, you know, have construction be matched, that would be great. But I think there definitely needs to be a little bit more of a look around some of the synergy that we can create with the multiple funding opportunities, for sure.
Thank you. Harry, now I'm done. Thank you.
Carlos Ridhuejo.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Mel and Melissa, for this excellent presentation. My question was a simple one. On that chart that you had with projected revenues and expenses through the next few years, what assumptions were used regarding inflation? Thanks.
Sure. So for the town side, we essentially have assumptions around collective bargaining. So we've got a 3% assumption in 23, a 3% assumption in 24, reverting back to 2% in the out years. For non-personnel, our growth is around 2.5%. On the revenue side, so our local receipts, I kind of outlined some of the assumptions on revenue for that. And then in terms of the school budget, those projections are coming directly from the school department.
So that differs from the present, 7% inflation. So we're not taking into account the current inflation.
So we're currently, we have a school budget allocation based on the available revenue that we have. And then in the out years for the schools, it's based on their current revenue, current expenditure projection.
Thank you.
Danelle O'Neill.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you, my Mels, for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I just have a couple of questions. Mariam brought up something that made me think about the U.S. Open. And, you know, the last day of the U.S. Open is on Juneteenth. And I was curious if, you know, and maybe Heather or someone from that committee could answer, if there is a plan to do anything in regards to Juneteenth on that last day of the U.S. Open. I mean, even if it's a gesture for Lee Elder, who passed away last year. So I was wondering if there was any funds available other than looking at the Racial Equity Advancement Fund or anything like that. Any plans or any monies put aside for the U.S. Open in regards to Juneteenth? So that's my one question. I have another question, but I want to know if someone can answer that one first.
There's a community partnership committee that has been created that is handling some of the community programming. I'm quite sure the town will have its own celebration regardless of what the USGA may do, but we do know that the USGA and the CPC has been talking to them about the the coincidence of having their tournament on Juneteenth, and I know that there's some plans to do that, but the CPC is the ones who are kind of deciding how to expend the funds. Primarily, the town is getting funds through the acquisition or the delivery of complimentary tickets to the event, and those are being used. We're monetizing those and using those for fundraising for community purposes. So I'm sure the CPC has a process to allocate those funds.
And then my second question has to do with the body-worn cameras and the Brookline Police collective bargaining agreement. So I guess my question is, I guess I ask you this every time I see you, Mel. My apologies. But where are we with the collective bargaining agreement with the police and like the policy? Have they narrowed down the policy in regards to the body-worn cameras yet, so we can start discussing that as a town?
Well, we can't. I can't really reveal what's being discussed in collective bargaining, Danelle. But I will say that the last collective bargaining agreement that the town reached with the police acknowledged and accepted the concept of body-worn cameras by the police. So that has been accomplished. And then the actual practical implementation of that, including policies, is currently being discussed in our bargaining. We're currently in bargaining right now.
Okay, thank you.
Dennis, that's it.
Oh, great. So I have a couple of, just a couple of very quick questions. So one is just a trivial detail about how to read one of the charts that you put up, Melissa. The question is about the MBTA charges. Are those embedded inside the state and county line? It wasn't obvious from the presentation.
So they're found within non-appropriated. So there's a separate section in the budget for non-appropriated, and you'll see the detail for all of those accounts.
Because when I saw it, I just thought I saw, a very sort of high level roll up, and maybe it's rolled up under state and county and it wasn't on your chart because I just didn't see MBTA when you were presenting. So
I think it was on Mel's slide, kind of just talking about the overall impact of state aid. So essentially any growth we got in revenue was washed away by the charges. So,
right. So I'll wait until I see the actual, full document. That leads to the question, which is, we have enough new advisory. This is a selfish question solely for the advisory committee, but we have enough new advisory committee members now who have not been through an open gov session that it would probably be very helpful sometime in the next couple of weeks to make sure that we have a walkthrough with you or Justin or someone to get people trained on how to use it.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else from see David Pollock? I was going to ask if anybody else has questions. It would be great if we can wind down with a few minutes break for biological imperatives before we go to our separate meetings at 7:30. But I think this has been great so far. Thanks. I think David, you have a question.
Yeah, just a quick follow up on the Community Preservation Act committee that Heather said is going to get named soon. I went with my client to that committee in Lexington a month ago for Housing Authority funding, and then 2 months ago in Arlington a month ago, and Lexington 2 months ago. So I'm a little worried about the compression before town meeting, and have all of the potential applicants been notified to prepare their appeals for funding so that at least that's all queued up for the committee so that it can be ready by town meeting? Because in the other towns that I've been to, it's a longer process, gets started a lot sooner.
David, I think it still will be a longer process. I think the goal for the May town meeting is to just make sure that we're allocating based on the required preservation, and there are requirements for funding that we need to allocate funds to, and then the committee can do the work and support projects beyond those allocations.
So, but town meeting has to vote the funding ultimately before it can be spent. So that would happen in November?
Yes, that's
Okay.
what I'm anticipating, is that November would be where
Okay.
some of the detail would be.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it? No other curious members of the select board or the advisory committee? Because if not, we'll save 15 minutes of our evenings before getting together again for another few minutes. Great. I don't know if we need a motion to adjourn or not.
May I just say something,
Oh,
before we adjourn?
absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to
Absolutely.
say thank you so much for being willing to do this jointly. I always learn a lot from the AC and the questions that you guys ask, and I hope the feeling is mutual. And this really saved our staff, who has been working incredibly hard on this, from having to do this presentation twice. So I hope it went as well for others as it did for me.
Yeah, I
thank
think
you
this was
all.
great.
Great questions, and we look forward to continuing to answer questions and resolve this this budget challenge this year.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And reminder to the members of the public who are watching that the select board and the advisory committee each have meetings coming to a Zoom chat near you in about 15 minutes. If you care to watch more of how the sausage gets made around here. But otherwise, we'll see the advisory committee in 15 minutes.